Welcome, friends, to this first Thursday in November Convocation. I'm Resident Charles Svensson, and we have an excellent presentation in store for us this afternoon, and I will introduce her in a moment. Our hymn is hymn number 169, Dear Lord and Father of Mankind. It was written by journalist, poet, abolitionist, and Quaker John Greenleaf Whittier of Massachusetts in 1872. And as a Quaker, Whittier frowned on some of the more pietistic and enthusiastic activity amongst the Friends meeting around the country. So he wrote this hymn originally as a poem just to kind of calm his fellow Quakers down. There's also a hint of today's theme in this hymn, so please look for that too. Please remain seated as we sing together 169, Dear Lord and Father of Mankind. In keeping with that earthquake theme, let us hear Psalm 46. God is our refuge and strength, a very present help in trouble. So we will not be afraid, though the earth should quake and the mountains fall into the depths of the sea. Though the waters of the sea rage and foam and the mountains tremble at the tumult, there is a river, its streams make glad the city of God, which the Most Holy has made a holy dwelling. God is with her, she cannot be shaken. God will help her at the break of day. Nations are in tumult, kingdoms are shaken, but the Lord has spoken, and the earth melts away. The Lord of hosts is with us, the God of Jacob is our refuge. Come and see what the Lord has done, the devastation brought on the earth. The Lord makes wars to cease in all the world. The Lord breaks the bow, snaps the spear, burns the shields with fire. Be still and know that I am God. High over the nations, high above the earth. The Lord of hosts is with us. The God of Jacob is our stronghold. The word of the Lord. Our prayer this afternoon is one our rector at St. James Episcopal in South Pasadena offered last Sunday. It's a prayer apropos at this time for our country and taken from the Book of Common Prayer. Shall we pray? Almighty God, who has given us this good land for our heritage, we humbly ask that we may always prove ourselves a people mindful and glad to do your will. Bless our land with honorable industry, sound learning, pure manners. Save us from violence, discord, and confusion, from pride and arrogance, and from every evil way. Defend, O God, our liberties, and fashion into one united people the multitudes brought out of many kindreds and tongues. Endow with a spirit of wisdom those whom we entrust the authority of government, that there may be justice and peace at home, and that through obedience to your law we may show forth the praise among the nations of the earth. In time of prosperity, fill our hearts with thankfulness. In the day of trouble, allow not our trust in you to fail. All which we ask through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen. It's my joy and honor to introduce to you Dr. Lucy Jones. You received her bio this morning in the Minder, so I'm not going to reiterate that. But her talk this afternoon is Thinking Like a Scientist about Questions of Faith. And she also has a subtitle, which I'll ask her to share as well. She plays the viol, and I'd like to know what the difference between a viol and a violin is. And she's also the senior warden at St. James, where I attend. And we are Presbyterians. We have no idea what a senior warden is, so I'm going to ask her. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Lucy Jones.
Thank you all. Glad to be here. I'm wondering where I should start this, with what a senior warden is? Well, and actually, it is sort of where I'm going to start. I'm a lifelong Episcopalian, got brought up in the church. My grandfather was a Methodist theologian, taught at the theology seminary at the University of Nanking. So I have a background with China, a lot of connection. My mother was an Episcopalian, and when my father married her, he was happy to convert from being a Methodist, because, yeah, he went along. And a senior warden is the head of the lay leadership. I assume there's some sort of president of a council. Yeah, that's the equivalent. Except the way the Episcopalians work, there are two wardens, a senior and a junior warden, sometimes also called the rector's warden and the people's warden. The junior warden is chosen by the vestry, and the senior warden is chosen by the rector. So I'm supposed to have the extra job of basically keep taking care of our rector and making sure that he's fine. I've actually had the extra obligation, joy, burden, something like that. The vestry is the one that actually calls a new rector when the time comes, so I led the committee that selected Father Greg Kumura, who joined us back on Easter. So that's, both my science and my faith come from my family. So my grandfather was a theologian. His son, my father, became an aerospace engineer. Sort of growing up in China, he was like, what people really need is help from the annual floods and he decided he would become a fluid engineer and come back and build the Yangtze Dam. And his parents were sort of, oh, what's an engineer? Oh, okay, sure, dear. Right? But he then got his degree 3 months after the Korean War broke out, so much for going back to China. And turns out that air and fluids really behave the same way, and his fluid engineering degree was perfectly acceptable to go become an aerospace engineer. And I grew up with him flying regularly to Cape Canaveral for launches and great excitement about science, and he handed me my first Isaac Asimov book at the age of 12, actually saying, the heroine's a lot like you, a precocious girl like you. And I'm like, I wasn't sure what precocious meant, and I decided I needed to read the book to figure out what my father was saying about me. But out of this background, I think one story worth telling about my grandfather, he retired to Pilgrim Place in Claremont when I was 10 years old. And actually, I guess he was visiting, looking into it a little bit earlier when I was just taking my catechesis, my catechism to be confirmed in the Episcopal Church, actually in 4th grade. And I got into an argument with him about how many sacraments there were, because I happily repeated what my priest had told me, that there were 7 sacraments. And he proceeded to take me through the Bible, demonstrate that Jesus had only actually instituted 2 of them, and that the 5 others, while we might consider them beneficial to your spiritual health, could not be considered in the same class as baptism and the Eucharist. So what did I learn out of this? Well, one, that my priest wasn't actually speaking for God when he told me things, but also that the most intelligent person I knew considered spirituality and theology worth a lifetime of study. And I was never able to then just dismiss religion, as so many of my colleagues did when I went into science. So I went on and I was, maybe I was reading all that Isaac Asimov. I was just as arrogant as most physicists, right? Physicist is the real science. Then there's there's the dirt people and those chemists, but physics is the real one. It was only in college when I met 2 geophysicists who, like, why do you want to be a physicist? That's making bombs. Geophysics, you get to play in the mountains and get paid for it. And since I had grown up hiking the Sierra Nevada, I took my first geology class actually as a senior in college and realized I'd found my love. I read the whole 900-page textbook in the first week to show what a geek I am, because it was just so fascinating. I couldn't put it down. And I went on to become a seismologist. Right? So I had to figure out how to bring being a scientist together with being a person of faith. And I went through the usual college level, what am I doing here? Am I really wanting to be part of this? And I'm going to take you through a little bit about what a scientist is so that we can look at how I was able to reconcile the two. Fundamentally, science is a process for determining what's true. You come up with a hypothesis, but you come up with ways of testing it. And you've got to make sure that the data fits, and it's got to work. I'll give you a bit of an example from my own field, sort of looking at plate tectonics. You probably got told, Alfred Wegener developed this with continental drift. In fact, he was really out to lunch. Right? He looked at what happened with South America and Africa and said, boy, they must have been connected. So somehow they're drifting apart, and the continents are pushing through the oceans. Well, that's physically ridiculous, because continents are lighter and weaker than ocean floor. Ocean floor is heavier. That's why it sinks and is lower down and has an ocean on top of it. Right? So the physicists all said, this is ridiculous. The data was there. It was data that mattered, but he had the really wrong theory for what happened. The solution came later, actually with World War II, and all of the U-boats being hunted, the navies hunting for the submarines to protect themselves. They dragged magnetometers behind the Navy ships across the ocean. And what they discovered when they did that is there was a magnetic signal on the ocean floor. And over time, it happened over the 50s and into the early 60s, recognizing that the pattern of magnetic signal on the ocean floor was representing the time when that ocean floor had solidified, what came up as magma and solidified. When rocks cool down through the Curie point, which is about 500 degrees centigrade, it takes on the magnetic field that's around it. So these signals that we're seeing represented the magnetic field of the Earth at different times, and they recognized they were symmetric around the mid-ocean ridges. So instead of somehow the continents pushing through the ocean floor is being created at the mid-ocean ridge, and it carries the continents along like passive passengers. So what had been a completely wrong idea but the data was okay, finally got explained by having a new set of data. And this all brings, there was also then the distribution of earthquakes, same sort of time. When we finally could find out where the earthquakes happened, we put out a big network of seismometers that was in the late 50s, early 60s, to monitor the nuclear test ban treaty, right? And we also got to see all the earthquakes. And we were able to finally locate the distant earthquakes well enough to recognize that, in fact, they happen only in very discrete locations, or 99.9%, right? You can always have an earthquake somewhere. But most of them are in these very discrete patterns. And we started recognizing that these were plates, that you've got the mid-ocean ridges where you're creating new ocean floor, and then you have the subduction zones where you're subducting the ocean floor, because otherwise the Earth would be growing, big problem. 3 different, completely independent pieces of data: the shape of the continents and the matching of geologic formations across them, the magnetic signature of the ocean floor, and then the location of earthquakes, all fit in the same theory. So plate tectonics got put together, and now, then you say, okay, well, if this is true, let's test something else. Like, we should be able to say where oil will form. And in fact, plate tectonics did a brilliant job of predicting where oil is. Now, we're not so happy about that, but right, we got a lot of oil that we have burned up and put into the atmosphere through plate tectonics. So this is sort of the key of what the process is. You get a model from one set of data, you test it against some other independent information, and the model that Wagner had was proved wrong. The model that Hess had turned out to be right and got further matched by the earthquake data. And when your data is inconsistent, you have to figure out why. As humans, we love our models. We want patterns. Patterns make us feel safe, right? And scientists like the patterns as much as anybody else. That's what we do. We make patterns and try to test them. What we have to do, though, is accept that if the data really doesn't match, we give it up, right? There's a famous story about somebody who'd really opposed plate tectonics, seeing that magnetic data at a big meeting. And everybody, it was all put up in a room. This famous Harvard professor came in. He'd been very opposed to plate tectonic ideas. Everybody stops to watch how he's going to respond to the data. And he finally looked around the room, finally came up to Harry Hess and said, "Congratulations." Turned around, walked out, left the meeting, went back to Boston. It hurt really badly. But because he was a good scientist, when the data was overwhelming, you give it up, right? So that, to me, is how you have to think about things. And when I first got into, when I was doing physics, when I went to MIT, it was 1976, we often forget about this, but the Big Bang Theory was considered way out there, was not accepted. There was a steady state theory. That's sort of our null hypothesis. Things are what they've always been. Right? And it was one of the reasons scientists didn't believe in Christianity. There was all that creation myth stuff. Clearly not true, right? Except as the Big Bang Theory came together, started recognizing that there was a beginning to the universe. And finally, as you develop all of this data, you're able to say that we went from nothing to everything in something less than 10 to the minus 38 seconds. That's what we can constrain it with the data we have now. Sounds like let there be light to me. And when I came to realize that this really was true, and this whole steady state thing that a lot of people had said was a reason not to believe in a religion, I found for myself that the simplest explanation of creation is a creator. And it drove me to come back to church. I felt the need to respond to it. And I had to be that. But you know, in addition to the Big Bang Theory, which I think proves creation happened, the theory of evolution is just as good, and the data is just as good, if not better. Right? So to be an Episcopalian earth scientist, I have to believe that God chose evolution as the way to create us. And to me, and that is a pretty significant question. Why would he do this? Because evolution is cruel. It's painful. Cancer is an evolutionary oops. Autism, which my own son suffers from, a lot of my family does, goes along with being a physicist. But that's an evolutionary oops, and it's a lot of pain. Right? So what was so important to God that evolution's required? And, well, there's some ways we can think about it. The other thing about being an Episcopalian is we are supposed to rely on tradition, reason, and Scripture. Right? And Scripture gives us a really straightforward statement of what God thinks is important. What's the first commandment? You shall love the Lord our God with all our heart, with all our mind, with all our soul. And the second is like to it, love our neighbors as ourselves. So Scripture tells me really clearly the most important thing to God is love. And to connect that back to evolution, I would recommend reading, I don't know how many of you have heard of John Polkinghorne. Yeah, right? He's a theologian. He began life as a mathematical physicist. He was part of creating quantum theory and resigned his endowed chair at Cambridge University in mathematical physics at the age of 40, saying, us mathematicians do most of our good work young and probably don't have anything left to contribute. And he left his professorship at Cambridge to go to seminary. Right? And so he understands a lot about the physics of the world, and he thinks that quantum theory and evolution are a mechanism for free will. That love compelled is not love. That if God wants us to love him, we have to be free to choose to love him or not. And if he created us in any particular way, he would have to create us as creatures that loved him or as creatures that didn't. And that evolution made us completely free to make that choice. And that therefore it's worthwhile. But that also means that who we are is some mix of that evolution and all those evolutionarily described bodies and thought processes with the call of the divine. Right? So we evolved, and we have, how weird it is that we all believe in, the idea of God is universal to humanity. We're responding to something. I mean, I've heard atheists argue that, it's an evolutionary, it's a fix. It solves some other, we have a desire. It makes us feel better. But who's ever evolved something? You don't evolve a need for something that doesn't exist. I think, right? So that we've all evolved this response that we're, some recognition of the divine, whether we accept it or not, to me says that's there. So here we are as human beings with these various thought patterns that got us through evolution, that allowed our ancestors to have children, right? And the divine. It's actually the way I cope with St. Paul. I've always found quite a bit of him a little difficult to take. But, the flesh and the spirit. Think of the flesh as our evolutionary described thought patterns. Not inherently wrong, right? It's the need for food, the need for sex, and the need for safety are the troika, the three things we need to survive evolution. And then the call of the Spirit, which is the divine calling us to what's good. Right? So, let me move on. Yeah. Evolution has a lot to say about how we respond to risk. So now I'm going to take it a bit more to my actual research. I think you're probably all aware that I'm a seismologist. I've spent a long time doing that. and my lovely son is trying to talk to me, but I sent him away. And over time, I began as a statistical seismologist. I looked at the patterns of aftershocks and foreshocks and tried to see what we could predict out of that. Because human beings don't like uncertainty, right? And especially the future is a very uncertain thing. And a lot of it's because in our evolution, we needed to be able to respond quickly. And emotions are the mechanism that gives us value, right? It helps us determine the weight of a judgment. They've done studies on people who've lost emotional capacity through some brain injury. Perfectly intelligent people who can't make a decision. Because emotions are what give us that feeling of good or bad and help us make decisions. And when you get into risk, it becomes even more important because that need to feel safe is down there with the need to eat. And various models have been put together in a variety of ways. I'm going to give you some work from a guy named Paul Slovic. If you get interested in this, he's the one to follow up. He's written a book called On the Perception of Risk, a psychologist who did a lot of work with Kahneman and Tversky. So if you heard of Kahneman and Tversky, the Thinking Fast and Slow, right, if you've heard that book, recognizing that we have an analytical thought process that takes time, allows us to do fact-checking, allows us to do tests, usually gives us the more accurate answer. But we also have an affect-based system. Does it feel right? Right? And that's the one, your fight or flight instinct, that's the one that you respond to when you're responding to risk. And so I can go and calculate as a seismologist what the hazard is. What's the probability of an earthquake in some time frame, or what's going to be the impact of what we're going to be doing. But it's the affective system that controls our decision to act, right? The analytical one can be more accurate, but we don't act unless we're emotionally engaged. And that's this absolute need to feel safe. Mm-hmm. So when I think about who I am, how I'm responding to the world around me, I see that this idea of what I feel is human, but it isn't necessarily the divine. And I'm now going to take a bit of a switch. I've taken us through a lot of philosophical meandering, and look at what this means for climate change. Because you may know me as a seismologist, and in fact, that's what my Ph.D. is in. But I've come to realize that what's coming from climate is so much worse than what any earthquake could give us. I can't justify talking about earthquake safety if we won't deal with the climate. Individually, we have an earthquake on this fault right here. I'm not sure if you're aware that the base of this mountain is something called the Sierra Madre Fault. 7.5 possibly. It's going to be really bad. For us, that will be a terrible experience. But climate is happening to the whole world. And the scope of what we're doing and the increase in disasters, not in earthquakes. Earthquakes happen too deep in the earth to have atmospheric changes make a difference. But the increase in wildfires, the increase in floods, landslides, all of this is coming as so large. And climate change, I just took you through how we do the theories. The theory here is just as strong as anything we've heard about. I'm going to take one moment to do about it, right? You've heard of greenhouse gases, right? There's actually a really simple way of understanding why. When photons come off the sun and hit a molecule, it makes it vibrate, and that's an absorption of energy, right? And if you have a 2-atom oxygen molecule, I think yes, you can now spin it, you can maybe compress it. There's relatively limited ways for it to move to absorb that energy. When you have a 3-atom molecule, you can now bend it. And you have a whole other realm of ways in which it can absorb energy. So anytime you have a 3-atom molecule, it is going to absorb more energy than a 2-atom molecule. Nitrogen and oxygen, the primary components of our atmosphere, are 2-atom molecules. Carbon dioxide and water are 3-atom molecules, and they absorb about 4 times as much energy as the other ones. Well, yeah, I think that's about right. If you have 5 molecules, you can bend so much more. So methane is a much stronger greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide, because it's got 5 molecules and you can twist it all up as the energy comes in. This was recognized a century ago, and it was talked about. It would seem like if you put more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, we should be absorbing more heat. But 100 years ago, there wasn't much of an impact from the Industrial Revolution yet. We were still adding carbon to the atmosphere. It hadn't made that much of a difference. We were finally getting confirmation that it actually happened in the 1980s from the Greenland ice cores. So they were able to go in and take out a core of ice from within there, and then there's pockets of air. So we have samples of ancient atmosphere in those pockets. And you can date elements in the ice to get how old it is, and then you can look at the different concentrations to see how much carbon dioxide there was in it. And there's some other chemicals that you could analyze to determine what the temperature was. And when that data was put together, the temperature data is in red and the atmospheric CO2 is in blue. And whenever the atmospheric CO2 goes up, so does the temperature. This is a 800,000-year time frame. So you can also see that these changes in the natural environment happen slowly. As you grow a lot more, there's a variety of ways that the carbon can change. There have been some really big volcanic flows that really changed carbon concentrations, and then there's a bit of a feedback loop. You get a lot more carbon, you grow more plants. It's, if you have a lot of carbon dioxide, plants have more to hook in. You get more plants, you deposit more carbon in stuff on the ground, and you get these feedback loops. You get these variations. They happen on slow time frames. If you look at what's happening now, that's where, so the left is actually current time, and the other that goes to the right is time before now. That blue arrow is where we are with CO2 concentrations. If you can see the numbers, this graph goes up to 300, and that's where it was, about the time I was getting out of college, 40 years ago. It's now over 400. Okay. We have really increased it. And if you then look at this, here is the average global temperature over that time from 1880 to 2020. That's how it's gone up, because the carbon's going up. But remember, let's imagine we were somehow miraculously able to stop producing carbon dioxide right now, which we're a long ways from, but let's imagine it. We're still at 400 parts per million in the amount of carbon that's already there. And that's like we've piled a bunch of blankets on the atmosphere. And those blankets are still there. If we stop producing more carbon, we stop adding to the blankets. Right? We probably have another 0.5 degree centigrade to add. If we were to, the moment we can eliminate all carbon, then we still have about another 0.5 degree C to add to the average temperature. You see it's gone up about 2 degrees C over this time frame. Oh, wait a minute, so I did this in Fahrenheit, right? So it's almost a full degree Fahrenheit. We'd go up to 3. So even if we stop now, we still have more warming to happen. And a decade ago, as I started getting more into this, I thought that the issue was data awareness, that people didn't understand this was going on. And I don't know if you guys have seen this. I saw a YouTube video of a cellist who had taken this data and came up with a scaling function that a 0.5 step musically of pitch for each 0.03 degrees centigrade, and played it on his cello to show that it went from the very bottom all the way up to the top. But it wasn't music, right? It was a chromatic series of notes. For those of you who read music, here would be the equivalent. I was started this in 2012 when we'd only gotten up to 2 Ds above middle C. In the next 5 years, we added another fifth. Right? So you can see a bit about the rate. There's variability. Things happen. Volcanic eruptions put dust in the atmosphere and cool it off for a bit till the dust gets settled out. Right? So I decided to take this as what's, right, now we can get back to the first question. What's the difference between a viol and a violin? Right? The viol, also called the viola da gamba, because viol sort of sounds like something really disgusting, so we tend to use the Italian term, which means viol of the legs. It's something that you hold like a cello. It is a completely different family of instruments from the violin. A violin has 4 strings tuned in fifths, violin family, so violin, viola, cello. They're all 4 strings tuned in fifths with a curved back and a curved side. The shape of the instrument creates a lot of overtones. Right? A viol has a flat back, sloping shoulders, creates less overtones, but more resonance. So they're very similar instruments, but they're different. They have a different sound to them. The viola da gamba has 6 strings and frets. I got a chance to play it in college. I had been a cellist as a child. And the lovely thing about a gamba is I could not play for 6 months because I had a full-time job and kids, and come back, and I was still in tune because there were frets. Whereas I really didn't like listening to myself on the cello after I hadn't played it for 6 months. So I ended up, and I just loved the music of Renaissance music in the 17th century. I sometimes said that once I discovered the 17th century, I never saw a reason to return to the 20th. But it's a different type of music. It's not fundamentally around harmony and chord progressions. It's polyphony, where each voice is more equal, and you have a discussion with each other, essentially. You toss around themes. And there's a very common style within it called an innomine, which actually comes from the Benedictus, and it was a famous tune in the 17th century from a mass that everybody knew. And that tune got turned into the basis of a lot of music. It's actually the very beginning of Western music. Do you ever wonder where the word tenor comes from? Tenori, stretched out. It was taking a tune that you had, and you used it as your base, cantus firmus, and then you put a melody above it, the cantus altus, where the alto comes from, and you put a melody below it, the cantus bassus, and then sometimes you'd add a descant that is now we call soprano. It comes out of a different form. So this idea is that you'd have a tune that everybody knew, and that the origin of polyphony and instrumental music was based around this tenori, this stretched out cantus firmus, and then tunes around it. And so I got the idea of taking this data and making it the cantus firmus. Right? I hadn't actually composed since college, but I spent about 6 years working on it. Let's see, yeah. Here is what the data for the cantus firmus looks like. You can see starting at I don't know how many of you read music. You are all playing the hymn, right? Start 2 Bs below middle C, go around various weird notes, and end up at 2 As above middle C. Right. So if we have the time, because this is really towards the end, and then we can have discussions. I'll show you what I ended up, let's see. Yeah, okay. I got the opportunity to perform this, and actually tomorrow night at the Colburn Conservatory, their Baroque ensemble is going to be playing this. They've taken it over this will be 4 violas da gamba. So it's not just that the temperature's going up, the rate of change, the rate of going up is going up. Right? And human beings do a really horrible job of extrapolating exponential growth curves. If you take, they've done studies, even with a scientist, if you don't let them make the calculation and they just have to in their head extrapolate, we always turn into linear extrapolation. So we always underestimate how quickly an exponential growth curve grows. And I think we're seeing it, right? The last few years, it's every year, it's obvious how much more it's going up. If I added on the 3 years, or the 6 years since I ended this in 2017, we'd have to add another sixth. It's now up to the F above, 2 Fs, 3 Fs above middle C. So I would say I wrote this when I thought data mattered. I think in the intervening time, I had the opportunity to create a project that's been pretty amazing. Music for Climate Action, where we've brought together the climate scientists who know what we need to do, the social scientists who study our psychological barriers, our emotional barriers to action, with musicians who know how to evoke emotions. And the question is not whether this is happening anymore. The problem is the temptation of the flesh to ignore it, because we have an evolutionarily deeply derived need to feel safe. And we are geared for short-term problems, for the predator coming after our children. When it is a long-term problem, like climate change, for which you feel relatively powerless, what can you do as an individual? The only way to feel safe is to not think about it. And so we all know it's happening, and we still go on, because what else do you do? Well, I'm going to show you what we can do. One thing is when you look at where we're looking, these data are the total amount of carbon emissions by various types, right? And notice that cement production is pretty high up there. It's not one you usually think about, but let's see, oh, yeah. I think the lower one is actually, well, yeah. Oh, I see, yeah, the upper one is per year and the lower one is cumulative, right? So our rate of increase is still increasing on our carbon production as well. Right? One thing when you think about what you can do, a lot of people talk about what we should give up. We shouldn't drive our cars. We shouldn't eat meat. We shouldn't have children. There's two problems with this. One is a psychological phenomenon known as loss aversion. If we have to give something up, we don't like it. We would much rather, the pain of giving something up is like twice as bad as the gain of getting something. So if you want somebody to do a good job on give them a bonus, don't give them a bonus. Give them all the money up front and tell them you're going to take away a part of it if they don't meet their goals. Much more effective than giving a bonus to get people to do things. And as long as we present the solutions to climate change as what we give up, people would rather not think about it. And second, it doesn't work. There are 8 billion people in this world who need to eat and stay warm in winter. In other words, who need energy. As long as our energy system produces carbon, no amount of deprivation is going to solve the problem. We have to fundamentally change the way in which we do our energy systems. That's the only way. Right? The personal actions give us a bit of time. If we use less energy now, it's going to help keep it from being quite as fast an exponential growth curve. But fundamentally, we have to decarbonize the system. And that might sound like, yeah, no big deal, change the way our whole society produces energy. In fact, we're well on our way. The majority of energy in California is now renewable. Southern California Edison has been a world leader in how to transform the systems. Pasadena has made a commitment that the Pasadena municipal utility will be totally carbon-free by 2030. The department is screaming about it, but the city council has told them, we got to do it, and they're finding ways. Right? So it's not easy, it's hard, but it's definitely doable. And I must admit this week, I worry about the national commitment, and it's very easy to despair. And despair, well, I was always taught in my catechism that that's a sin, because it's giving up on God, it's giving up on hope. It's also very destructive. You don't act if you don't think your actions make a difference. So we need to remember that the really big changes are going to happen locally. This is about Southern California Edison transforming its network. This is about Pasadena City doing it. And us supporting our local jurisdictions in moving forward on this is really big. The other really big one we need to do is talk to people about it. To resist the temptation of the flesh to ignore the problem and have the courage to care. because that's the only way we're going to make a difference. There are still some technical problems. The big one is air travel and construction materials. Right? We have to change those. Construction materials, we're well on our way. Air travel, we still haven't figured out how to get a big hunk of metal up in the air without the energy concentration that we get from diesel fuel. But we're working on it, and I think that that's going to change. So I started off talking about faith, ended up with climate, because I think it's the same thing. I think acting on climate is the most important moral obligation that I can face. And of course, I have a role, I have a public pulpit that people listen to me about this. And especially this week, I realized I need to make the commitment to staying out there, to talking about it, to creating local communities that act about it. Because it's when we do it together, when we love each other, and that our love for our community includes the love for the physical aspects of our community. That's going to be one of the big differences. One of the things I found in doing this, and I'll use this as my last note, because I am getting towards the end, you wanted some questions. I've had the opportunity to do works in various cultures with this. The Tempo project was funded by the US Japan Foundation, and we did it jointly, bilaterally, between the US and Japan. The wonders of Zoom, you can do simultaneous translation. And it was amazing. We had seminars in both countries through Zoom. It was all during the pandemic. It was an amazing process. And I've also done quite a bit of work in New Zealand that I've been there because of my earthquake stuff, but it's moved into this. Western culture, and coming out of Christianity, is a unique perception of our relationship with the physical world. We have dominion over the earth. The other cultures, when you use the word community in Japanese, it includes the physical environment. My community includes the stream running through the town. Same with the Maori in New Zealand. I would recommend, if you want to follow up on this, looking what the church in New Zealand is doing. It's the Anglican church, though I think there's a lot of Presbyterians in New Zealand as well, and I think they're engaged, right? And I think they're engaged in this process as well. The ones I had talked to were the ones in Wellington, and that's the English part of the country. But the incorporating Maori values is about, is saying that the earth is as important as we are, that the earth is our community. And I think that spiritually we need to get there because we are killing the earth. The earth will survive. Human beings won't necessarily. Within the lifetime of my grandchildren, who are already here and adorable, at least 1 billion people will be living in areas where agriculture becomes unsustainable because of the increased heat. We talk as though sea level rise is the big deal. Agriculture is already failing in countries like Syria from the heat. The estimate's 1 billion people will be facing the need to choose between moving and dying. We don't handle the level of immigration we've got now. What are we going to do when there's 1 billion people that have to go somewhere else? And I think that the World War is a really likely option if we do nothing. So we need to not just solve the physical problem, we also need to solve the community problem of that our community is more than just Pasadena or just California or just the United States. And on that cheery note, thank you. Do we want questions now, or?
Let's do questions. Lucy, that presentation is going to stimulate lots of conversation. So Q&A from those of you who are here present in Marwick Hall. Lynn?
Thank you for all you're doing and for being here with us this afternoon. It seems that the rumor is that the EPA will soon be dissolved. Do you think that this hope and drive, collective drive for climate remediation is in our DNA enough to be able to survive that organization dissolving?
Yeah. In California, yes. I think we're going to start seeing bigger and bigger divides between the states. I actually had a young man working with me for a couple of years who, when he first got his geology degree, worked for the Texas EPA. He said, you know how bad a polluter you have to be to get the Texas EPA to go after you? And, you know, I think that the rhetoric about government regulation is going to succeed in getting rid of this in some places. But all that's going to happen is those places are going to fall behind the rest of the world. We also have to remember the United States isn't the whole world. Europe is moving forward. China's really moving forward, and they were horrible polluters, right? So what I think is going to happen is the rest of the world is going to move on to green technologies, and we'll have developed it, and we're going to have to buy it from them. And this is part of it. We're going to no longer be a world leader on it. So I think that those pockets where, yes, that's the way what will be happening. But I think that states like California, we're not going to go back on this. And, you know, the governor's already called an emergency session of the legislature of how to protect what we do here from this. So I think it's going to be a difficult time. But I think it's local action. And, you know, I think within the next 4 years, the chances of a hurricane coming through Miami and destroying it are significant. But also, Miami's going underwater, right? Sea level rise is real. Most of Florida is less than 8 meters in elevation. I don't think it's that long before a lot of the damage coming is going to be unavoidable, right? Think about what's happening in Canada in the last 2 years. The forests are on fire over the whole country, right? And it's accelerating. It's an exponential growth curve. I think 4 years from now, the level of disasters that are coming from it are going to be so obvious, it's going to change the discussion. I think there's a lot of damage that can be done. I worked for a government agency for 33 years. I left in 2016 because I think that truth matters, right? And we're going to do a lot of damage. I have a son who's just got his Ph.D. in climate science, organic chemistry, and he's got a job interview with the US Geological Survey, and he's not going to do it. So we're going to lose a lot of expertise and talent in our government agencies, but there are other approaches. I think the academic institutions become even more important. Yeah.
Other questions, comments? Yeah, Norm?
As a scientist, what do you think the odds are that human civilization will survive climate change?
A long ways from 99%. So many unknowns. That's the problem. I started talking to the social scientists and realized that the variables in social science are so much larger than the physical variables. I think at this point, the chances that we are going to see large parts of the Mideast uninhabitable are, that physical question, I think are high. Because we aren't stopping this, and it's already failing the agriculture there. The thing is, there's winners and losers, right? Canada's going to have a lot more arable land coming forward. They're going to lose their forests, right? We're seeing big ecosystem shifts. The human response to it, we can choose to fail God in this situation. We can choose to not love our neighbors enough to get through this. And I think the hope is going to lie in humanity, in the spiritual side of believing enough to make this worthwhile. I will also say if it was just up to the United States, I think we'd lose. But luckily it's not.
Other questions, comments? Back to Lynn. Lynn, you're just a plethora of comments here this afternoon.
I hit a button over here, huh?
Bringing it back to our little square of turf, and perhaps your square of turf where you
I live in
lay your head
Pasadena.
at night.
Yeah.
What are you doing just personally?
Actually, thank you, because I should have said this. I usually do, and I put it in my sermon at the convention, and I forgot it here. There is a really important thing you can do, and that, we actually started calling it the Tempo Pledge, put it in with the music. And that is to pledge that going forward, and I realize that everyone in this room is more towards the end of our lives than the beginning, but never again buy a fossil fuel powered appliance. You don't have to get rid of any one that you have. But going forward, if you need to buy a water heater, if you need to buy a car, if you need to buy a stove, buy electric and not gas. Electrification. If we all did that, obviously not going to happen anytime soon in the US, but a lot of us could make this. I'm doing this. If we all did it, we would meet our emissions goals. It's incredibly powerful for a couple of reasons. One is that electric appliances are just a lot more efficient use of energy than fossil fuel powered ones. You know, when you run a gas stove, maybe 30% of the energy that you create by burning that fuel gets into the food. On an induction stove, it's 90%. Right? You don't heat up your room as you do this, and then you don't have to run more air conditioning to cool off the room after you've run the stove. Right? All of that sort of stuff, and heat pumps are incredibly efficient now. They didn't used to be, but they really are now. If we all did that, we'd meet our emissions goals, and it's the one biggest thing that you can do personally. And then I'd say the second thing is to support the electrification, the conversion of our electrical system. Edison's going to have to spend a lot of money to be able to handle the increased load if we all move to electrical appliances. And they're going to have to come up with rate changes. And that's, Pasadena Municipal Utility didn't want to do this because they were going to have to put through a bunch of rate increases. And the city council said, yep, we're still doing it. So supporting the entities that are moving us towards electrification is incredibly important.
So related to that is the energy production needed to generate the extra electricity will come from where?
Well, and that's already Edison's majority solar energy production. So, right, this is true even with dirty energy because they're more efficient. But as the grid improves, we then move further that way. But solar and wind generation is cheaper than a coal plant now.
Thank you, Dr. Jones, for, I don't pretend to understand what you're talking about, but, but you have given us a lot of scientific evidence, data, and also your preference on the effective and analytical. But you say the analytical is more accurate than the effective. I would say, like a Taoist, I would say you have to have both.
I absolutely agree. You get a more accurate answer, but the affect system is what allows us to choose. That's what supports our decisions. So, and one of the important things to do, I think, is to reconcile them. It's one of the reasons I turn to music. That music can help us process our emotions, because the emotions by themselves are pushing us to ignore it. We'll feel better if we pretend it isn't happening. Right? So it's how do we reconcile the two, because yes, absolutely both are needed. Yes, ma'am.
The Eeyore in me has this question for you, just really getting down to brass tacks. How are you going to get a 5-star Michelin chef to give up his gas stove?
Give him an induction stove. It's faster than gas.
Oh, really?
Oh, absolutely.
Awesome.
I've had an induction stove for over a decade, well, yeah, 15 or 20 years now, and I can boil a pot of water in a minute. And the minute you turn it off, it disappears. Because what it is it's a magnetic field that causes the pan itself to oscillate and therefore heat. And so there's no excess heat. It's all in the pan, and the minute you turn off the magnetic field, the pan stops heating. It's so much better than gas. There's just a lot of prejudice because there's bad electric stoves out there.
Yeah, Judy.
And how many five-star chefs are there out there? But anyway.
First, I should. Thank you so much. It's been very informative. This is a very practical question. I have a friend who has an induction system. I couldn't possibly afford it. Where do we find if, for instance, if this community wanted to all go to induction stoves, is there a financially viable way in which we could do that?
They are a lot less expensive than they were. They are still more expensive than a standard gas stove. This community has the option. The Southern California Edison Company has an appliance testing center that any new appliance has to be approved for use within the grid, and they do testing for commercial appliances. When they are done with them, they donate them to nonprofits. So our church is trying to, we had a 1930 electrical system that was an incredible fire hazard. We have finally upgraded it, and we're putting in solar with it. But we went to Edison, and we've got a commercial dishwasher and individual induction systems. So we didn't get a full range, but we got two burner systems that we can use. And actually, just go to Target and you can get a 1-burner induction for like $50. That actually is really cheap, just one, like a portable burner, and it's a lot safer than the other types anyway. So.
Oh, thank you again. One last remark. Instead of thinking like a scientist about questions of faith, I would prefer thinking about like a believer, in our case, Christian, and about the questions of faith. And in short, the question is not either or, but both.
I stand here as someone who's both, but I have to reconcile them to be able to be both.
That's probably the benediction, the reconciliation of both in terms of our scientific knowledge, but also in the way that we act. So can we show our appreciation to
Thank
Dr.
you.
Jones? So what we heard was a macro summary of history leading to the present. Now we're going to move in the opposite direction from the present of where we are now. Look back at history next week. So Ron, say a word about next week's convocation.
Next week we're going to listen to Tim McCalmont, a Presbyterian pastor, but the associate director of the film on Henrietta Mears. And so it'll be a very interesting convocation. Come and join us.
And just in case you need a teaser, this is sort of like a trailer for a movie. How many of you were interviewed for that documentary on Miss Mears? If you were, please raise your hand. Because we have several. Okay, Nancy, right? And who else from the Grove was interviewed?
Kathy and Dale Bruner, Bill and Polly Craig.
And they'll all be giving autographs afterwards as participants in this event. So that'll be next week. Same time, snacks at 3:30, and the presentation will start at 3:45. Next. No, this will not be a screening because it's not been released for public consumption yet. They're still working on final touches to it. We hope to have access to that documentary sometime after the first of the year, and we will incorporate that into a convocation when it becomes available. Okay, so last comment.
We have places at our table with Shirley, with Lucy. I kept calling her Shirley Jones, which is a completely different person. With Dr. Lucy Jones tonight at the table, so please join us. She's not going to be eating with us, which means that we can throw her all the questions we want. So please join us for dinner.
Thank you all. Blessings, and thanks for being here.